The Navy told its observation pilots they were the eyes, and when it equipped every battleship and cruiser catapult squadron for the duration of the war. The observation pilot's role was described in the Naval Aviation Training Command's doctrine as critical to fleet gunnery, to search and reconnaissance, to anti-submarine patrol, and to the rescue of downed aviators from waters where no other aircraft could safely operate. The Kingfisher was, in the official materials, a versatile instrument performing a multiplicity of essential functions that the fleet depended on. The men who flew it were part of the fleet's operational core. They were told their mission mattered. What the Bureau of Aeronautics did not put in those doctrine manuals was the specific operational reality of what the eyes of the fleet actually looked like from inside a Kingfisher cockpit at the moment of the catapult launch. The catapult that fired the aircraft from a battleship or cruiser at zero airspeed with a force of approximately 140 feet per second in a distance of 40 feet, producing an acceleration of 27 g that the pilot absorbed through his body in less than half a second. Or what it looked like 6 hours later, when the Kingfisher had been flying over open ocean since the launch, and the ship that had sent it had moved to a position the pilot could calculate only approximately, and the weather had changed, and the fuel state was doing the arithmetic that fuel states always do, and the landing had to happen on open Pacific water, regardless of what the swell period and wave height were doing at the moment of arrival. The eyes of the fleet. That was what the doctrine called them. Here is what the documented operational records called them. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the United States Navy lost 179 OS2U Kingfishers to all causes: combat, operational accident, weather, open ocean landing failures, and the specific category the accident reports listed as catapult malfunction, which covered what happened when the mechanism that was supposed to accelerate a fully loaded aircraft from 0 to flying speed in 40 feet did not perform this function within the engineering tolerances the pilot's survival required. Of the approximately 1,500 Kingfishers that served in American naval aviation during the war, roughly 1 in 8 was destroyed. The men who flew them operated an aircraft whose maximum speed was 164 miles per hour, slower than any Japanese combat aircraft they might encounter, slower than many of the American aircraft whose downed pilots they might be sent to rescue, and significantly slower than the speed required to make any meaningful evasive response to a zero intercepting them over contested waters. They operated without a wingman in most configurations. They operated without radar. They operated over oceans that the Pacific War had made contested in ways the pre-war doctrine had not anticipated, in an aircraft that the Naval Aviation Training Command classified as observation, and that the Japanese Navy classified as a target. That was the institutional claim. The documented reality lived in the specific physics of what the Kingfisher was and what it was asked to do with what it was. The Volt OS2U Kingfisher, the primary production variant, was a single-engine low-wing monoplane designed for shipboard catapult operation in either floatplane or wheeled configuration. Her Pratt & Whitney R985AN2 Wasp Junior radial engine developed 450 horsepower. Her maximum speed at sea level was 164 miles per hour. Her cruise speed was 119 miles per hour, a figure that existed in the same general range as the PBY Catalina, and that placed the aircraft in the category of things in the sky that other things in the sky could catch without difficulty. Her range with standard fuel was 805 miles. Her armament was 2.30 caliber machine guns, one fixed forward firing through the propeller arc and one flexible on a mount in the rear cockpit operated by the observer. That represented the absolute minimum in defensive armament that any armed aircraft in any theater of the Second World War carried, and that were inadequate against every Japanese combat aircraft they might encounter by margins that the ballistic comparison makes embarrassingly clear. She was, in the specific physical sense, a light aircraft. She weighed 4,123 pounds empty and 6,000 pounds fully loaded for a standard catapult launch configuration. She was not fragile. The floatplane structure was robust enough to survive open ocean landings in sea states that would have destroyed a purpose-built racing floatplane, but she was not armored, not self-sealing in her fuel tanks in the early production variants, and not designed with any particular feature that reduced the consequences of an enemy round entering the airframe. The catapult launch from a battleship or cruiser was the defining physical experience that distinguished Kingfisher service from every other form of naval aviation, and that the training manuals described in procedural terms that conveyed the sequence of events without conveying what the sequence of events felt like to the man being accelerated through it. The powder catapults fitted to Iowa-class battleships and Baltimore-class cruisers fired through a two-rail track mounted on the ship's main deck or superstructure, typically trained athwart ships or slightly aft of the beam to avoid the ship's own superstructure and to position the aircraft in the best wind angle for initial climb. The Kingfisher, with its floats and full fuel and ordnance load, sat on the catapult car in a configuration that placed the pilot's body at an angle to the direction of acceleration that the catapult officer had calculated as optimal for the combination of wind speed, ship speed, and sea state at launch time. The pilot checked the engine at full power. The catapult officer verified readiness. The firing mechanism discharged. In 0.4 seconds, the aircraft went from 0 to approximately 55 knots. The acceleration load on the pilot's body during this interval was approximately 27 g, 27 times his body weight, applied as a forward horizontal force for less than half a second. The pilot's trained response was to press his head and back firmly against the headrest and seat back, relax the muscles that would fight the acceleration, and maintain grip on the controls without applying inputs that would destabilize the aircraft as it left the catapult track at the edge of flying speed, with the floats inches above the water and the full power of the engine fighting to build the speed that would convert potential disaster into controlled flight. This was the launch. This happened before the mission. The mission itself was the eye of the fleet's specific function, flying out ahead of or around the fleet, locating enemy ships or submarines, adjusting the gunfire of the ship that had launched it, patrolling assigned sectors, and occasionally, with increasing frequency as the war progressed and the rescue mission became the Kingfisher's most significant single contribution, landing in open ocean to recover downed aviators from waters where no ship could safely go and no other aircraft could land. The gunfire adjustment mission was what the doctrine had specified as the Kingfisher's primary function, and it was the mission that placed the aircraft in the most consistently exposed position relative to enemy fire in the most consistently predictable way. An observation aircraft adjusting gunfire for a bombardment is, by definition, operating in the airspace directly above or adjacent to the target that is being bombarded. The target's anti-aircraft defenses are, by definition, actively engaged at the time the observation aircraft is present. The observation aircraft's contribution to the mission, providing accurate fall-of-shot corrections that improve the bombardment's effectiveness, requires the pilot to fly a pattern over the target area that exposes the aircraft to the target's defenses for the duration of the fire mission. The Kingfisher doing this at 119 miles per hour cruise speed, without fighter escort, without armor, with .30 caliber defensive armament, over Japanese shore installations that were firing back with whatever anti-aircraft capability they possessed, was performing an act of sustained exposure that the doctrine had classified as acceptable operational risk, and that the pilots performing it classified with the more specific vocabulary that direct personal experience of acceptable operational risk tends to produce. The numbers that establish the gap between the official account and the operational reality of Kingfisher service have a specific character that differs from the numbers in the destroyer scripts and the carrier scripts, because the Kingfisher's operational losses were not concentrated in dramatic large-scale battles, but were distributed across hundreds of individual missions in every theater of the war, each one representing a small, individually documented transaction between a two-man crew in a slow floatplane and whatever the operational environment produced on that particular day. From 1942 through 1945, Kingfisher squadrons flew from every American battleship and cruiser in the Pacific, from warships in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, from shore bases in Alaska, in the Caribbean, and from the forward islands of the Central Pacific Campaign. The individual mission records are archived in the action reports of the ships they served, in USS South Dakota's records, in USS Indianapolis's records, in the records of every ship that carried a catapult and an observation squadron. Aggregating across those records produces the operational profile that the training manual's description of the mission did not fully capture. The open ocean rescue mission deserves concentrated attention because it was the mission that the Kingfisher's operational record shows as its most significant human contribution to the war, and because it was simultaneously the mission that imposed the specific combination of demands most likely to destroy the aircraft and the crew performing it. A carrier pilot who ditched after a strike, a B-29 crewman who survived a crash landing in the Pacific, a patrol aircraft crew floating in a raft 200 miles from any land. These men required rescue, and in the specific circumstances where rescue was required, the Kingfisher was often the only aircraft capable of providing it. Not because the Kingfisher was designed for open ocean rescue. It was not. It was designed for gunfire adjustment and observation. But because it could land on water that no other American aircraft with meaningful range could land on. And because the men in the water required something to land near them and take them aboard, and the Kingfisher was what was available. The physics of landing a floatplane on open Pacific Ocean are not the physics that the training manual's description of water operations conveys in its technical language. A floatplane landing on a calm harbor or a protected anchorage is a manageable task that the pilot's training has specifically addressed. A floatplane landing on open Pacific swell in a 2 to 3 meter sea state, on a heading selected to minimize the swell period's effect on the landing run, while also positioning the aircraft to reach survivors who may be drifting, is a different exercise. The Kingfisher's main float extended approximately 10 feet below the aircraft's fuselage and was the primary water contact surface during takeoff and landing. Its hydrodynamic behavior during the landing flare, the moment when the pilot reduced power and raised the nose to decelerate and contact the water, was predictable in calm water and considerably less predictable in swell. A swell cycle at sea presents a water surface that is rising and falling several feet per second at the moment of landing, and the timing of the pilot's flare relative to the swell cycle determined whether the float contacted rising water or falling water, which determined whether the deceleration was gradual and manageable or abrupt and violent, which determined whether the aircraft remained intact or was structurally compromised in a way that made the subsequent open ocean existence of the crew considerably more complicated. Pilots who had done this multiple times described the calculation they made on the approach, reading the swell period, timing the flare, committing to a contact point, and then accepting whatever the ocean's actual surface was doing at that point, as one that no training exercise had fully prepared them for. And that experience improved in ways they found difficult to articulate, because the improvement was not procedural. It was the specific calibration of judgment that comes from having gotten it right. Enough times that wrong became distinguishable from right before the moment of commitment rather than after. When they got it wrong, the most common result was structural damage to the float, crumpling, cracking, or tearing of the float structure that rendered the aircraft unable to take off, but not necessarily unable to float, converting the rescue aircraft into a second object requiring rescue in the vicinity of the first. The action reports document multiple instances of this outcome across the war, in which the Kingfisher crew joined the survivors they had come to rescue as additional occupants of rafts or floats waiting for the destroyer that was eventually dispatched when it became clear that the aircraft would not be returning. The specific incident that illuminates what Kingfisher rescue operations cost at their most concentrated is the rescue conducted by Lieutenant, junior grade, John Burns and his observer, aviation radio man, 2nd Class Alfred Bryce, from the cruiser USS Minneapolis in the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, one of the earliest major documented Kingfisher rescues of the war, and one that established the template for what this mission actually required. On that day, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, American carrier aircraft were engaged in strikes against Japanese ships. He recovered 2 survivors from the water, loading them onto the Kingfisher's floats and into the rear cockpit in a process that the aircraft had not been designed to facilitate, and that required improvised physical management of men who were injured, exhausted, and experiencing the specific cognitive impairment that extended ocean immersion produces. required, building speed against the aircraft's excess weight until the combination of speed and lift took the aircraft off the water with a margin that the action report, written in the clipped language of official documents, described as adequate. He returned to Minneapolis. The 2 survivors were aboard. Burns received the Navy Cross. What the Navy Cross citation described was the action. What it did not describe was the specific interior experience of the takeoff roll in a floatplane carrying twice its designed passenger load in a combat zone, building speed in open Pacific swell that was not flat and was not cooperative, with the engine at full power and the float still in the water for longer than the numbers said it should be. Burns flew 23 more Kingfisher missions from Minneapolis before the ship's catapult deployment in his theater ended. He never described in any account preserved in the historical record what the takeoff roll on May 8, 1942 felt like from the cockpit. He described the action. He described the survivor's condition. He described the weather. He did not describe the moment when the float was still in the water at the end of the takeoff run, and the numbers said it should have left already. The maintenance and operational support that the Kingfisher shipboard environment imposed on its crews was a dimension of the service that the doctrine's description of the observation pilot's role did not address, and that significantly shaped the pilot's daily existence between missions. The Kingfisher aboard a battleship or cruiser was maintained on a rotating catapult, typically positioned on the fantail or amidships deck of the ship, exposed to the full weather environment that the ship's operating area produced. The North Atlantic produced conditions that ice formed on the aircraft's float and control surfaces in temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that the North Atlantic in winter reached regularly, requiring the aircraft maintenance crew to chip ice from the aircraft before it could be safely launched. The Pacific produced the opposite extreme, tropical heat that softened the doped fabric covering some control surfaces, degraded rubber fittings in the fuel system, and produced thermal expansion in aluminum components that the maintenance tolerances had to accommodate. The 2-man pilot-observer crew that flew the Kingfisher shared a cockpit arrangement in which the pilot occupied the forward position and the observer occupied the rear position, facing aft on a rotating mount that gave the observer access to the .30 caliber flexible gun and to the radio equipment that was the primary means of communication with the ship. The rear cockpit's access to the radio placed the observer at the center of the flight's communications function, providing fall-of-shot corrections to the ship during gunfire missions, transmitting position reports during search missions, calling in rescue locations during recovery operations. The observer also provided the second pair of eyes that the observation mission's name implied. In a 2-seat aircraft without radar flying over open ocean or over enemy coastline, the rear-facing observer's systematic scan of the airspace behind and above the aircraft was the primary warning system against Japanese fighter attack from the aft quadrant. The .30 caliber flexible gun was the primary and only defensive response to that attack. The psychological texture of the rear observer's experience in a Kingfisher operating over contested Pacific airspace was specific and has been described in post-war accounts by men who survived it with enough consistency to establish that it was genuine and universal rather than individual. The observer faced aft. He could see where the aircraft had been. He could see the sky from which a Japanese fighter would approach. Because Japanese fighter approach geometry from the rear was the standard tactical choice against a slow aircraft that could not maneuver meaningfully at combat speeds, he could see the threat coming if it came. He could not alter the aircraft's flight path. He could inform the pilot and man the gun and do what the .30 caliber's ballistics permitted against a target approaching at 200 miles per hour closing speed. Most observers reported that the experience of systematic aft hemisphere scanning over contested airspace over extended periods produced a specific and sustained psychological state that they described in the imprecise language available to them as waiting. Not alert watchfulness in the military training sense, the trained-specific attention of a man looking for a specific threat in a specific direction, something more sustained and less focused than that. A background awareness of the aft sky that was never fully off, and that accumulated over hours of flight into a wait that the mission debriefing and the meal and the sleep between missions partially resolved and partially did not. The fatigue that Kingfisher operations produced had a specific character that differed from the fatigue documented in other aviation roles. Carrier pilots and bomber crews were exposed to high-intensity acute stress during specific mission phases. The attack dive, the bombing run, the carrier landing, punctuated by periods of lower demand. Kingfisher pilots and observers operated at a sustained moderate level of demand throughout every mission. The catapult launch, the navigation over featureless water, the gunfire adjustment exposure, the open ocean landing, the takeoff and return, without the acute peaks that punctuated other aviation roles, but also without the lower demand intervals that allowed the nervous system partial recovery between stress events. The cumulative effect of this sustained moderate demand across months of battleship and cruiser deployments was documented in the medical records of Kingfisher air crew with a consistency that the flight surgeons attached to observation squadrons noted in their periodic health assessments. Sleep quality was poor. The specific inability to stop the scanning function that extended over water flight produced even in environments where scanning was not required. Appetite disruption was common. The specific anxiety that open ocean landing in deteriorated sea states produced in men who had experienced bad ones showed up in the pre-flight period of missions where the forecast or the observed sea state suggested conditions near the margin of what safe open ocean operations required. This anxiety was not incompetence and it was not cowardice. It was the specific psychological response of trained men to a documented physical danger that they had experienced with enough frequency to have calibrated accurately. The men who had bounced afloat hard in a bad swell and felt the structure absorb the load and recovered and flown home knew what the load felt like and knew what the structure's response to it felt like and knew that the load could exceed the structure's response if the timing was wrong. This knowledge was accurate. The anxiety it produced was proportionate. The men flew anyway because the mission required it. They flew into conditions they knew were marginal, and they managed the outcomes of those conditions with the skill and judgment that experience had built. And when the outcomes exceeded what skill and judgment could manage, they went into the water with the people they had come to rescue, or they went into the water alone, and the ship sent another Kingfisher if it had one, or it sent a destroyer if the tactical situation permitted, or the search found them, or the search did not find them, and the mission record received the entry that mission records receive when the aircraft does not return. The Kingfisher's post-war legacy reflects its operational reality, with the honesty that institutional accounts rarely provide. It was replaced almost immediately after the war by helicopters, which could perform the rescue mission more reliably and the observation mission adequately, and which did not require a catapult, and which could land on the ship's deck rather than in the ocean, and which represented in almost every operationally relevant dimension a superior solution to the problems the Kingfisher had been solving since 1940 at the cost the record shows. The men who flew the Kingfisher understood this without requiring anyone to explain it. They understood that the aircraft they flew was not the premier instrument. They were not the shining spear. They were the men sent out in a slow floatplane to adjust the guns and look for submarines and land in open ocean, to pick up pilots from better aircraft, who had the misfortune of needing to be picked up by whatever was available, which was them, which was the Kingfisher, which was what there was. One of those men was aviation machinist's mate first class Donald Cvi of Gloucester, Massachusetts, who flew as the observer in the rear cockpit of Kingfisher No. 9 aboard the battleship USS New Jersey from September 1944 through the end of the war. Cvi was 26 years old. He had grown up in Gloucester, which is a fishing port, and he knew the Atlantic and its weather in the specific way that men raised near water in New England know it. Not as an abstraction, but as a physical presence with moods and patterns that experience makes readable. He had volunteered for naval aviation with the observer rating because the flight pay was better than the surface rating, and because the idea of flying appealed to him in the way that things appealing to young men in 1942 took on a specific urgency that the times provided. He flew 29 missions from New Jersey in the Western Pacific between September 1944 and August 1945. He flew gunfire adjustment missions over Japanese installations in the Philippines and Okinawa. He flew search missions over waters the fleet needed scanned. He flew one rescue mission on April 12, 1945, when New Jersey's Kingfisher was directed to recover a Marine F-4U Corsair pilot who had ditched approximately 40 miles northeast of Okinawa after being hit by anti-aircraft fire during a ground support mission. Cvi transmitted the position and the situation as the Kingfisher descended to the water. The swell period was approximately 8 seconds in a 2-meter sea, conditions the pilot assessed as workable. The landing was manageable. The Corsair pilot was in a raft in relatively good condition, with a leg wound from the anti-aircraft fragment that had also destroyed his aircraft, but had not penetrated anything that blood and a compress could not manage adequately. Loading him onto the Kingfisher required Cvi to exit the rear cockpit onto the float while the aircraft was bobbing in 2-meter swell, stabilize himself against the float's motion, and assist the wounded man from the raft onto the float and into the rear cockpit, a process that the Kingfisher's designers had not specifically engineered the aircraft to accommodate, and that required improvised physical management of a man who weighed approximately 180 pounds and could not use one leg. It took 11 minutes. The takeoff run in the swell took another 4 minutes. The float left the water with a margin that Cvi described in a letter to his wife written from New Jersey 4 days later as enough. He did not say what enough meant. He described the Corsair pilot's name and his hometown, Norman Klug from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and what he was saying when they pulled him out of the raft, which was something about his wife that Cvi said he was not going to repeat in a letter, but that he thought about afterward. Cvi returned to Gloucester after the war and went back to fishing. He fished the waters off Cape Ann for 33 years, on his own boat and his son's boat and eventually his grandson's boat. He died in 1988 at the age of 70. His family described him as a man who was comfortable in rough weather in a way that went beyond professional skill, a man who had some specific relationship with bad conditions at sea that he had never fully explained. His grandson, in an account he wrote for a Gloucester Historical Society project in 2004, said he had once asked his grandfather what the scariest thing he had ever seen at sea was. His grandfather thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "It was not a storm, and it was not combat." He said it was a 2-meter swell on a flat, calm day. No wind, just the swell running through, because the swell meant an aircraft landing was going to be a specific kind of conversation with the water, and the conversation could go either way. His grandson said he had not known what his grandfather was talking about. He said he still did not entirely know. He kept the answer anyway.